Welcome to the 2021 Trust Barometer launch, and thank you for joining us. What a year this has been. I still remember it like yesterday that we were sat in the Bibliothèque Solvay discussing and debating trust in trade with the Chinese ambassador, with a representative from the US Embassy, and of course, someone from the European Commission as well. Little did we know at that time that COVID would come to impact so much of our lives. I still remember also how we felt. The European parliamentary elections had taken place in 2019, and the institutions had had a good run. There had been a good turnout, the mainstay parties had done pretty well, and we were now looking to turn the page. We also had a new commission, a gender balanced commission for the first time, a commission that would be 50% representative of women. And there was ambition at the heart of the European project, a new Green Deal, a fantastic new agenda on tech and trade. So here we were, after 10 years of European crisis, the financial crisis, the Greek crisis, the immigration crisis, and of course, the Brexit crisis, an opportunity to turn the tide, turn the page, and move on to something new and fresh. But sitting there in the Bibliothèque Solvay, something didn't quite feel right. It was obvious to a lot of us that COVID was going to have an impact. The degree of impact, no one knew. So we fast forward to the last 12 months and sitting here today as we look to debate trust in the EU. And has it been a positive 12 months for the European Union? Or have these been more challenging years and months than we have ever seen the European project have to contend with? So look, first we will turn to the data. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Kirsty Graham. She actually joined us during the pandemic. So like a lot of people probably dialing in today, she hasn't met many of her colleagues, but she is our CEO of Public Affairs. She's also our Global Chair of Health, and she joined us after spending many years at Pfizer and also the New Zealand Diplomatic Service. So first over to the data before we come back to the panel. Kirsty, over to you to read us through the Trust Barometer results 2021 for the European Union.
Thank you very much, Gurpreet, and it is indeed wonderful to be here. So good morning and good afternoon. I join you from New York, and as Gurpreet said, COVID has really changed our landscape. So let's have a look and go straight into the data and see what our survey that we released a few weeks ago has revealed. So I just want to start by giving a little bit of context around how we do the survey. It goes to 33,000 respondents in 28 countries. For the purposes of where you will see EU data today, that comes from France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, and the Netherlands. We have a lot of data to get through, so I'm going to go just very high level, but there will be data available to you for your individual countries. And I just want to say on this slide, we also make sure that our survey reflects both the general population and what we call the informed population, which are those who are college educated and who are in the higher income bracket. So we've been studying trust for 21 years, and what I think is really interesting is each year we have looked at a theme. And in 2016, we talked about the growing inequality that we started to see as a trend. And in 2018, we talked about the battle for truth. And I think what you're going to see in this data is that those two themes really still come through as even bigger trends. And so we have made the theme for the 2021 survey declaring information bankruptcy. We knew the pandemic was going to put extraordinary stress on trust levels. And this is because we faced a global economic crisis and a global health crisis, and in many countries, a global political crisis. So what's interesting here is we did our survey, our annual survey in January 2020. We did what we called a spring update, which is that little blue dot on the left, where we saw a rise in all 4 institutions we measured globally. And those institutions, just to remind you, are government, NGOs, business and media. all four institutions went up. But when we went back into the field in November and December last year for our January results, we saw significant declines. And that's what you see in the middle column, where government particularly took the biggest fall, 8 points globally. And if you look to the right, you can see some quite significant double-digit drops across South Korea, UK, China, Mexico, Canada, but big drops in trust for government. And in the EU, trust has increased for government and business, but no institution is fully trusted, which is the measure of 60%. So what you see here is 52 as the average of the trust index across the institutions, with business at 57 and government at 52. This, I think, is one of the more interesting findings of the entire global survey. Trust has moved local. My employer is seen as a mainstay of trust. And look at that, it rises in 18 of the 27 countries we surveyed. And significantly, if we think of business in 57 and government sitting at 52, trust in my employer in the EU is 75. That's a significant number. Just to say that the most powerful countries lost trust capital. If you look to the left, we looked at companies headquartered in each country, Germany, UK, US, and China. And to the right, you see trust in the national governments of each foreign country. And we saw big decreases for those countries is in both the business sector and in trust towards that government. Another very interesting slide here, and a worrying one for us as we think of what has happened to the world in 2020. We see the trust inequality that I referenced us spotting in 2016 as now a very significant gap between how people feel about those institutions globally, across the informed public versus the mass population. And I think this is what you see when you see parts of the population looking at the stock market, and then you see significant unemployment. But what we see here is a 16-point gap. That is the largest we have ever seen since we've been doing the survey. And we see double-digit inequality in a record number of countries. So the pandemic fueled fears that we already knew were in society. And just to show you what some of this looks like, people are most concerned not about contracting COVID, but about job loss, about climate change, and about cyber attacks. And the pandemic has certainly deepened these inequalities around the world, and a sense that 62% of our respondents said those with less education, less money, and fewer resources were being unfairly burdened by the pandemic. And as we think about, we ask people about problems foundational problems that they were most concerned about, and how had they changed in importance. Look at that, 63-point change in improving our healthcare system. But some very basic foundational needs coming through here around healthcare, poverty, education, and the economic and social divide. But just as we have some significant foundational problems, we see a crisis in leadership. In fact, societal leaders, by definition, we've included religious leaders, CEOs, government leaders, journalists, are not trusted to do what is right. And again, this theme of trust turning local comes through. When you look to the right-hand side, people are far more likely to trust their employer, their CEO, people in their community, and scientists. Now, we do still see drops, but that is really an indication that in the time of stress, people have turned to make trust very much a local sentiment. And it's slightly more disconcerting that societal leaders are suspected of spreading lies and misinformation. Our government leaders are purportedly purposely trying to lead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. 52% of people believing that, and 53% believing the same is true of business leaders, trying to purposely mislead them. So what we see from this is not just a raging pandemic, but a raging infodemic that is feeding mistrust. People do not know where to go and who to trust for information. Trust in information sources almost at record lows. And if you look to the right there, we see declines across all media, traditional media, search engines, owned, and social media, almost at the lowest levels that we have seen. News organizations are also seen as biased. People believe that journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead them. 55% of people agree with that. And news organizations people are concerned that they are supporting an ideology, and 64% believe the media is not doing well at being objective and nonpartisan. Another really interesting finding from this year's data: employer media is the most believable, more so than media coming from a government or national government or from the media itself. So people are turning to their employer for information. This represents a significant opportunity and, frankly, a responsibility for business leaders. We also probed the issue of information hygiene by asking people. We defined information hygiene as making sure that people were engaged in the news, avoided being in an echo chamber, making sure that they had a varied news diet, that they verified information, and importantly, did not amplify or spread that information until they had vetted it. And just 26% of people said they had good information hygiene. Now, when we think about that, the lack of trust in media, the lack of trust in spokespeople, and the misinformation, this represents significant threats for both our public health and for the global economy. And where those intersect most importantly, I think, for all of us right now, is in the reaction around vaccine hesitancy. Still remains a major hurdle, and we looked at people in terms of being willing to have a vaccine as soon as possible versus willing to be vaccinated in the first year. Now, I will say this data, as you'll be aware, is changing all the time as we see the vaccine rollout and very different rollouts depending on where people are located. But this correlation between information and vaccine hesitancy is really important. The pandemic also has driven a really interesting conversation around the workplace. And we asked people who had a choice about whether to work from home or to return to the workplace. 51% had chosen to work at home and 49% to return to the office where they had a choice. And for those who were working at home, it was driven by a fear of contracting COVID either in the office or commuting. And for those back in the office, it was around feeling safe and feeling more productive. So what we do look at now is a new mandate for business. And one thing is clear is that people want business to do more than just focus on the immediate business. What do we mean by this? Well, business is being expected to fill the void left by government. 63% of people saying CEOs should step in when the government does not fix societal problems. 60% saying CEOs should take the lead on change rather than waiting for government to impose change. And 63% saying CEOs should hold themselves accountable to the public and not just to the board of directors and shareholders. And this is interesting when we look at CEOs leading on societal issues. 81% of people in our European data expect CEOs to speak out publicly on societal issues. And that includes issues obviously around the pandemic, but also issues around job automation, job loss, and broader community issues. We asked people when thinking about employers to rank these variables on the left in terms of importance. And we see big rises in keeping workers and customers safe and in having regular employee communications and job skills training programs. So what we see here is some of those fears we identified earlier coming through as people think about their places and their employers. And consumers and employers are expected to have a seat at the table. This is an interesting data point as well. 69% say that consumers have the power to force corporations to change, and 59% say employees have the power to force corporations to change. So I have just gone quite quickly through a lot of data, and I now just want to say, what do we conclude from this? How do we emerge from what we're calling information bankruptcy, when we have the twin issue of the pandemic and this infodemic where people don't know where to go for trusted information? First of all, business needs to embrace this expanded mandate. CEOs need to lead on issues from sustainability, systemic racism, upskilling, all those issues that we saw people having fears around. It's very important that people act first and talk later, because what we also see from the data is people will measure companies by not what they say, but what they do. Second of all, lead with facts and act with empathy. They are not mutually exclusive. Societal leaders must have the courage to provide straight talk, but also empathize and show that you recognize that people have very real fears. Thirdly, given that role for the employer as a most trusted source for information, make sure you're providing trustworthy content. That really matters. And finally, don't go alone. I think if we look back on the pandemic and what we've learned, no one institution can go it alone. So business, government, NGOs, and others must work towards a common purpose and take collective action to solve the extraordinary range of issues that we have before us right now. So I just want to conclude by saying we will have individual data for each country available to you. That is a very quick summary of what we saw, but certainly a fascinating backdrop and a lot to discuss. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand back to Gurpreet now, who is going to introduce our panel. Over to you, Gurpreet.
And what a fascinating year, as we've kind of already been talking about. And thank you, Kirsty, for beaming in for us from New York to do that presentation. What a brilliant backdrop you actually had as you went through the presentation. So onto the panel. There's a lot to unpack here, and there's a lot of different debates that we probably need to uncover and discuss. So firstly, let me introduce our brilliant panelists, and I'm so grateful that they've made the time to be with us today. So first and foremost, Professor Peter Piot. He's the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also a special advisor to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. I'm delighted that he's been able to join us. Our second panelist is Luca Vicentini. He's the Secretary General of the European Trade Union Confederation, and really I'm hopeful that he's going to unpack that employer-employee relationship. What is happening there, and how does that come to life? Third, a lot of pressure on our third panelist, Shauna Davis, formerly of Euronews, is with us. What is happening to media? Media trust at an all-time low. And where do we get information from? And what is happening with misinformation? That's going to be a really interesting question for Shauna. And then finally, and last but not least, Robert O'Meara is the Communications Director of the European Roundtable for Industry, formerly from Microsoft and GE. Business, we have a new license to lead, according to our Trust Barometer. What is happening to business, and can business live up to these increased expectations as we look into 2021 and 2022? So we're going to construct this panel in some simple ways. Firstly, I'll come to each one of the panelists and ask you, what are your takeaways? What are the things that you are looking at from the data and also from the barometer? And what are your takeaways? What do you think is happening here? What do you think the challenges are? With the overriding theme, which we'll continue to go back to, trust in the EU. How is your specific area of work impacting trust in the EU? If you are watching in and you've got questions for the panelists, then please do pop them into the chat box, and we'll try and come to those questions as we work through the session. But first, Peter, over to you. What is happening to trust in the EU, and specifically through the lens and work that you are doing? What do you see as the challenges as we look ahead to the year ahead?
Sorry, I was still muted. So, yeah, hello, Gurpreet, and everybody. Welcome. Yeah, it's fascinating to see how trust in scientists ranked so high. I live in London, and particularly during the whole Brexit campaigns, the mantra was "Don't trust experts and scientists." So we see quite a reversal of this trend, and perhaps it's not surprising in the sense that uncertainty has been a hallmark of this epidemic, and managing uncertainty, in addition to all the other issues. And that's true for everybody's life, going from can I plan my holidays, but will I still have a job tomorrow? But it's also true for those in power and for politicians, and who have to take decisions that affect every walk of life of everybody, the economy, and so on. And this is where I assume that science comes in. Even if science certainly doesn't have all the answers for our problems at the moment, but there's been huge progress. And I think that it's particularly the development of vaccines in no time, basically. Normally takes 10 years, and now we had them in 10 months to a year. That's actually the most spectacular expression of this delivery of science. It's a kind of delivery. And also maybe people are asking and expecting for certainty. And some scientists present things in a more certain way than the facts are. But there are problems. I mean, fantastic progress in science development of vaccines. Now we're faced with manufacturing, very down-to-earth type of things. The supplies are not following, and we had underestimated that. I had underestimated how fast the vaccines would be there, but also overestimated the capacity of industry to manufacture in no time. But nobody has done it before. And we should continue also social distancing and so on. So it's interesting, how expectations of people are quite different. And that's where I'm quite concerned that the lack of trust in decision makers, in those in political democracies is going down, because frankly, from a historic perspective, the alternative is our anarchy or dictatorship, and that's the last thing we want. And many of these issues, I think, have been exacerbated. They existed before COVID. It's not my expertise, but when you look at it, COVID has exacerbated inequalities in societies. Not only it has exposed them, but it is those who were the most vulnerable already before COVID are even worse off at the moment. And so that is really affecting people's lives. And so we were expecting from our politicians, our decision makers, very simple, straightforward answers to very complex problems. And where you have this tension between, let's say, saving people's lives, public health, and saving the economy. We know in the meantime that you cannot save the economy without controlling the epidemic. But it looks like this tension is there, and how to solve it, I don't know. We have to do a better job in terms of controlling the epidemic. But just to end here, just before this, I was on a meeting, like my whole days are in Zoom, like most people, or whatever it is, with Singapore. In Singapore, they have 1 or 2 new infections a week. And when you look at East Asia and Southeast Asia, using exactly the same measures, social distancing, masks, testing, hygiene, they've been able to control this epidemic, even if the borders are closed and so on. Whereas in the West, it's really, in Europe, we're facing a third wave, in the US and so on. And I think we have to look here at culture, at the sense of community, and at trust. And so that's why it's really probably good to go back to basics. And and look always at what is it really that people are expecting, what can be delivering, and we can come back to that when it comes to the European level. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter, for those very, very insightful initial comments. Luca, I want to come to you next, because, of course, a lot of what we're seeing in the trust data is really this relationship between the employer and the employee. Is it really as strong as the proximity effect seems to imply, or do you feel that there's festering underlying challenges here that maybe impact as we come out of this pandemic?
Well, I think there are both elements to be considered, because it's clear that during the pandemic, in this very difficult situation, employees have looked at their employers as an element of protection. Also because not always institutions, even trade unions, were able to protect them properly, protecting their jobs, protecting their health, protecting their future. So there was for sure an increase of trust. But at the same time, I would say that this trust is absolutely conditional. Conditional in the sense that employers have to show that they are able to cope with these expectations, and particularly that they are able to continue protecting their employees, especially when we will gradually get out from the pandemic and entering into a very unknown territory in terms of what are the consequences of pandemic when the vaccines will be really available, and what's going to happen in terms of recovery, economic recovery, but also social recovery, and if in the end we will be better off or worse off in terms of inequalities, in terms of rights, protection, etc. So I would say that there are three key elements that will build more trust or will undermine the trust of employees towards employers. The first one is retaining jobs or not retaining jobs. Will be the employers able, in the long run, after the pandemic will finish and we will enter into this unknown territory in terms of the economic recovery, will be the employers able to continue keeping people in jobs? So far it was possible also because there was a lot of public money available for employers to do so, but is this going to happen also in the future? Big question mark. The second element is, will be the employers able to protect health of employees when the employees will be back to work? And also another big question mark. And third, and probably the most relevant question mark, is, will be the employers able to manage a just transition when it will come to automation, digitalization, greening the economy, key elements for the recovery, but if they are managed properly? Because if they are not managed properly with investment, skills, social protection, well, these challenges, we are going actually, on the contrary, to threaten jobs, to destroy jobs, and to create a lot of social injustice. So these are, in my opinion, the three key challenges. And, these are also the expectations among employees when it comes to institutions and even trade unions. Also, we as trade unions and also institutions have to show that they will be able to continue keeping the jobs, to continue preserving employment in the labor market when we will enter the recovery, to continue preserving the health of people and health of workers in the workplace, but more in general, in the society, in the normal life. And finally, if we will all be able to manage these incredibly difficult transitions that we have in front of us, making sure that the recovery will include green and digital transition, but will also include social justice, better and stronger social protection, better rights for everybody. There is an incredible divide when it comes to social protection and rights. There are too many workers that are precarious, self-employed, non-standard, don't have access to emergency measures and income compensation during the pandemic, don't have access to traditional rights, traditional social protection. And all these put at stake, I would say, the ethical behavior of all of us, ethical responsibility of employers, of trade unions, of institutions in coping with these challenges. A very last remark is about media, because there is also a labor-related issue when it comes to this mistrust that exists against media among the population, and is the fact that is too much increase in the precariousness of work among journalists and among media people. And now, if you look at how many precarious journalists and workers are delivering information to all of us, they are more than 70% in comparison to the stable journalists and journalists that have a decent working contract or a decent income. And of course, this lack of stability, lack of income, this precariousness creates enormous threats to independency and to liability of the information. People are, you know, they are submitted, let's say, they are under the power, let's say, of political and economic powers that, of course, they can threaten them just because they are not stable, they don't have a decent salary, and so they are not independent at all.
Yeah, Luca, you've touched on so many important points there. I think the first theme that you kind of outlined is this one of automation, right? So what actually happens to the workforce as we look to unpack, and the data touches on that. You know, there's a huge amount of concern and fear out there, but then in your closing remarks, you very importantly focused in on the discussion around media and misinformation. You know, who do we trust? And as Kirsty rightly outlined, we are declaring information bankruptcy this year. Our data is saying that actually there are few trusted sources out there when it comes to information, and that is storing up a huge range of challenges, and we'll come back to vaccine confidence in a second. But Shona, what is happening to media? And then more importantly, as you've focused in on the discipline of misinformation, how do we track and manage this? Because it seems to be everywhere, but no one really knows what to do about it.
I think the thing when it comes to misinformation is that it's not new. Fake news has been there for as long as we've been there. But in the midst of a pandemic, all of these things are elevated and escalated, and we are seeing the real world impact of that misinformation that was already pre-existing like never before. And that's for a number of reasons that was touched on in the report. For example, when people are nervous or scared, that emotional element of it, that misinformation gets pushed through. And there's no doubt as well, when it comes to our reliance on social media, we have an information overload, and not all of that information is good information. So when I look at the report, the one thing that stood out for me was only 1 in 4 people in the EU have good information hygiene. And we've known for so long the need to have strong media literacy, but that really hasn't translated in the European Union. Something that gives me hope is the trust in scientists and in science. That was Peter mentioned that, and for me there's a reason why that's a good thing for the media too, is that often we don't talk about this, the intersection between media literacy and science literacy that needs to be discussed more as well. People going from A to B on social media, and that process of trying to find out what is true and what is not is often linked to, you know, understanding the scientific method, and having that basis of the scientific method is really crucial. So I think if there is an increase in trust in science, I hope what could follow is a more increased trust in the media. I think the reason why we're talking about misinformation more and more is that we've known that it's been bubbling for so long, but now we are seeing the real world impact in different European nations, be that via protests on the streets, be that rise in conspiracy theory movements, and what we're going to talk later about is the health implications of misinformation, and particularly when we're talking about the next couple of months and years ahead, when it comes to what to trust and what not to trust.
But look, I just want to finally bring in Robert. Robert, this is a increased pressure or focus on the business community that we're now seeing. Is European business specifically ready to meet the demand of solve, not sell? Is this the year that we are now really there and really focused on trying to solve some of society's problems, and this increased mandate that Kirsty spoke about? Is our business community going to be able to meet that expectation and challenge?
Good afternoon. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this, and indeed the Trust Barometer results are extraordinary this year. I'm a fan of this survey, and if not necessarily the results this year, in terms of whether business is ready to solve, I can say that on some of the key topics that the report highlights this year that people expect CEOs to be more vocal on, I can say that on climate change, on inclusion and diversity, on reskilling, these are topics that have been on our radar for a while at ERT. And if you talk for 10 minutes with any of the CEOs and chairs that are in ERT, the subject of climate change will come up. They are very focused on the green and digital transitions that Luca mentioned. We as an organization, we were one of the few cross-sectoral organizations that gave vocal support to the EU's climate targets and the Green Deal last year. We just had a Euronews debate last month with Frans Timmermans and several ERT members, and we engaged with organizations like Industrial, like the European Climate Foundation, like E3G, and a bunch of other organizations across the spectrum. We also brought in, we promoted the event to the EU climate ambassadors as part of the EU Climate Pact. So we really tried to stir a public debate about the issue. And in relation to what you were saying about, act first and talk later, needless to say, I think here in Brussels, there is an emphasis on communication, and any association or organization is always trying to either establish or collect or amplify some of the key actions and commitments that are underway, and we're no exception. I mean, to get a richer idea of some of the commitments and actions that are in development, it would be remiss of me not to mention the website industryforclimate.eu, where some of those commitments and actions are outlined. And that's just on climate change. On inclusion and diversity, which is a topic that just really generated so many headlines last year, unfortunately for all the wrong reasons. We have been mindful of the issue of inclusion and diversity since a pledge that was taken in 2018. Last September, we launched a toolkit on this particular matter with over 30 case studies by companies led by ERT led by members of ERT, and they were across the different dimensions of inclusion and diversity. We also just launched or just released our voluntary targets for women in leadership report, which was released just about 2 weeks ago. There's still lots of progress to make. No one is disputing that. But as an organization, ERT is promoting knowledge exchange to try to build momentum around that. And we're certainly seeing a lot of demand and a lot of interest from both the members, the CEOs and chairs in ERT, and the people in the companies they lead. Then on reskilling, we spent much of last year researching and developing a reskilling initiative. It's advancing well, and we hope to unveil that before the summer, so please do keep an eye out for that. I mean, I do want to just point out that business cannot be expected to solve all of the problems. Government and society, and you say this yourself, Kirsty mentioned it at the end as well, governments and society and media all have a role to play. And global companies, such as the ones led by the members of ERT, they have global standards, but they still rely on governments and society as essential drivers of growth, of green demand, of intergovernmental negotiations, regulation, and so on. And you can't privatize human rights. Governments, society, and media all have their part to play, and business acknowledges that and really tries to work with those elements. So I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Robert, it does, and we're gonna try and unpick that in a second. But let me start, I suppose, with the tough question or the exam question. And Peter, I'm gonna start with you because depending on where you sit on the political spectrum, you can assess that this has been a good year or a bad year for the European institutions as they look to build trust. I want to come to each one of you individually and ask the question: in your opinion, has this been a good year or a bad year for the European institutions, particularly when we take a step back to look forward? 2020 was meant to be the year where a new commission kind of paraded its way out and focused on the Green Deal and had this gender balanced Commission, and also had a lot of ambition for where the future needed to go. And then the pandemic hit. And so from that point onwards, was it good or was it bad? Peter, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Gurpreet. Indeed, I came in at a moment when the epidemic hit Europe, and when, like for any institution, any business, any individual, whatever we had planned, collapsed in a way, or we had to adapt. And so I'm the scientific advisor to Ursula von der Leyen, and I must say that over this year, my respect for politicians, not everyone, but has really gone up. They have to face the voters like business people have to face the shareholders. We give advice, and that's easy. But I would say it's, of course, a mixed bag. On the positive side, I would say is that is very strong on the economy with the next generation EU. Unprecedented, 750 billion euro, including 90 billion to mitigate unemployment, and that is going to benefit the citizens and millions. But most people may never know that this is money that came from that initiative. That's the eternal problem. I remember during the Brexit referendum, like Wales voted for Brexit, and yet it was a massive beneficiary of European regional funds. I mean, that's how it goes. But that's, I think, on the positive side. We should not underestimate that. And that's also something that will have impact beyond the COVID. Secondly, that may be a bit more controversial, but what I'm going to say, but I think the joint procurement of vaccines was Europe at its best. In the sense that it assured that all member states, also including the small ones and the less wealthy ones, would have access to this life-saving vaccines. And I'll come back later on the negative side, what went wrong. And thirdly, I would say, I hope that with this epidemic, that health is now finally part of let's say, the competency of the Union. I'm not talking about health care. I mean, because every country has their own systems, and it would be foolish to try to uniform that. But when it comes to epidemics and infectious threats and viruses, they don't know any borders. We're so integrated that has to become the European Health Union. On the negative side or the challenge side, of course, I live in London, so I can tell you Brexit is definitely in there, and we haven't seen the end of the implications of that. But secondly, we were not prepared. No country was prepared. The EU was not prepared. The Commission was not prepared for this kind of epidemic. So we need to set up these institutions. And thirdly, on the vaccine delivery, if particularly then the biggest manufacturer that we were counting on, AstraZeneca, had delivered, Ursula von der Leyen would probably have been a hero, and now it's a scapegoat. So that's a matter of bad luck or whatever. It is something that it's nobody's fault in essence, because, as I said, nobody's ever tried to produce billions of vaccines in no time. So we're all learning, but the expectations were enormous. So I would say also, as a scientist, I also always try to find the counterfactual. If the EU would not exist, or if the Commission would have said, "Oh, health is not their competency, let the member states do," that would have been irresponsible to start with. Then the fire would also have been at the Commission. So it is really a very difficult thing. And to end, going back to what Kirsty said, and I really liked the 4 or 5 conclusions what to do. And the first one is act first and talk later. That's not going to be easy, particularly in our society. I refer to East Asia and Southeast Asia and Singapore. I think a big difference is the sense of community, giving to the community rather than our culture is more and more me, myself, and I, and and my freedom. And so not willing to give to the community, and that leads to atomization of opinions, the echo chambers in information. But I liked what Kirsty said. It's facts plus empathy. If you give cold facts only, doesn't work. I got COVID myself. I was hospitalized and so on about a year ago, and the earlier ones. And I came out, to say so, in early June, in May, because I had the long COVID. And the main reason was that I was really angry about communication by most governments. It was about flattening the curve, saving in the UK, the NHS, R North, and all these kind of things. And then it's about saving people. I said, this epidemic is about people, and it affects everybody. And so that's why this empathy with the facts is important, and also a degree of honesty. When things don't, when we don't know, we should say. But I think that we have an agenda, but there is no magic fix. For Europe, this has been a chronic issue. Particularly, I was interested, the proximity is so important. You trust your mayor more than the prime minister, and the prime minister more maybe than the European Commission. Okay, the distance is there, and that's not new. So I think you can't communicate enough, and I think this is where Europe could do more, even if there will be conflicting demands and contradictions in what we expect from our leaders. But that's so be it. And I think that I'm not against social media whatsoever, and I think we can capitalize on it, and just to turn it into something positive. But it's not something that you can control top down unless you're in a not in a democracy. Thank you.
Yeah, Luca, I'm going to pose the same question to you, but actually, Peter, I want you to come back to the question of vaccine confidence, and maybe in the next round, I want you to pick that up, because a lot of what you talked about was actually related to everything that the European Commission and the European institutions have been doing, but vaccine confidence was also a theme in the trust barometer, and in the last couple of days we have seen a lot of actions by a lot of member states and also by the institutions as well. So let's pick that back up. But going back to this question of, was this a good year or a bad year for the European institutions? Luca, from your perspective, where you sit, how are you seeing this?
Well, I think that the European institutions, and particularly the European Commission, did it brilliant during the pandemic. Just take three elements, that also Peter mentioned. The first one is that they put in place unprecedented emergency measures to support healthcare sector and services, to support businesses and to support workers and to retain them in their jobs. An enormous amount of money that's corresponded more or less to the whole amount of money that was put at disposal of member states during the financial crisis, around $500 billion, And after that, they came over with the recovery strategy, that is the double of that money. So if you put all this together, and also what the ECB did in terms of quantitative easing, etc., well, nothing like that ever happened in the European history. And if you compare with how slow and bad was the reaction to the financial crisis by the European institutions, with how quick and efficient was the reaction during this pandemic, well, this is really brilliant in my opinion. As is also very important, the massive number of social initiatives to address inequalities, to address the wage and labor markets lax, to address social protection systems that the European Commission is implementing during this period. So in this respect, the European Commission did a lot, but it's true what Peter said, that since there is a distortion in, let's say, the institutional setting, I would say, of the European Union, the merits and the good things that come from the European Union are always because of the member states, and the bad things that come from the European Union are always because of the European Union and never because of the member states. And this is a total distortion of the reality, and it's not only about media, reporting badly on this situation. It's also the fact that there is probably a gap in terms of institutional communication, but also, let's say, channels for democratic participation. The citizens don't know what's going on in the Brussels bubble. It's very difficult to understand, and it's very easy for the governments, for the national politicians, to use the European Union as a scapegoat for their own guilties. I mean, so there are a lot of elements in there that have to be considered, and this is also what happened for the vaccines, because it's true again what Peter said. The European Union did incredibly well with the public procurement regarding vaccines, taking care on vaccine supply for all the member states, and negotiating as a whole, as the European Union, with the big pharma. The problem is that the big pharma then exploited this for their own purpose and interest. There was no ethical responsibility at all coming from the big multinational companies producing the vaccines during this phase. And here we come to the last point I wanted to mention, and it's exactly what we said before about putting on the shoulders of businesses the responsibility of taking over from public authorities where they don't work. Of course, this is important, but first, businesses have to be responsible, and you have seen that big pharma were not responsible at all. The companies that, on the contrary, Robert represents and his organization represent have a completely different approach. So there are good employers and bad employers in the picture, and it's true what Robert said, that you cannot privatize rights. You cannot act in the business environment as regulation and public institutions don't exist. Also, in one of the questions and comments in the chat, is very true what Peter Alberto said, that employers, but also trade unions, don't have democratic accountability from the general public. This is the institution, so we need to reinforce the capacity of the institutions to react properly, and also to participate as social partners, employers and trade unions, in a process of dialogue that can really help not only in delivering results, but also in making people understanding that there are possible positive results if everybody is on board and everybody can participate in this kind of democratic, accountable process, I think.
Fascinating, Luca, and actually leads quite nicely into, Shauna, a lot of pressure, I suppose, on people like you and people that work with you. It sounds, if I'm interpreting the comments correctly, this is a communication problem. It's not necessarily a broader issue than that. So if the EU has had a bad year, then it's communication that seems to be at the heart of the problems that it's facing. How much do you agree with that? And also, we were debating before we came on air this broader challenge that if you look at the media outlets that the European Union has to rely on, they're predominantly English-based outlets. They are not outlets that are structured or based in the continent, for the continent, based through the European institutions. I know there are some, and obviously you worked at one, but they don't cut across in the same way. How much of this is really fundamentally how the EU gets its message out in comparison to other challenges?
I think when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, and it's really important to note in terms of even vaccine hesitancy, that's a real spectrum. There are people that are going to be concerned with legitimate concerns about taking a vaccine, for example, and that crosses into lots of areas in public health and more broadly. And then there are those that are going to twist legitimate conversations, be that scientific conversations or public health messages from politicians into disinformation, and we're seeing that all the time. And so, for me, one of the big things when it comes to political speeches, oftentimes there can be those who are trying to amplify complete falsehoods, but there's also those who, if there's a poor message, that can then be twisted and adding fuel to this already burning fire. And I want to point to the recent messaging about the AstraZeneca vaccine. When I look at the channels that, for example, on Twitter, that are known for often spreading disinformation, the twisting now is about, you see this is the evidence that we shouldn't be taking the vaccine at all. So that messaging and getting the nuance there is really, really crucial. And that can be difficult because, and again, the blame shouldn't be put on just one group here, because there are those who are going to twist it whether you give that good communication or not. So then it goes into whose responsibility should it be? for the curbing of misinformation, and how do we curb that spread? And that's a really difficult question to answer as well, because you have an underfunded media ecosystem, and particularly underfunded, and this is where we talk about languages, for example, that aren't English media and other media. They are incredibly underfunded as well. Even when we look at the IFCN, who do great work, it's often there are more English-speaking networks than others, and so it's a constant catch-up between these groups of fact-checkers trying to curb the spread, but often that disinformation is out there and it's too late to curb it back. So when you look at the trust barometer, and when you say trust is local, combating misinformation is local too. So how do we get the resources there to combat that at such speed and scale at which we're seeing it? That's difficult to answer.
No, it's a fascinating, and actually I was reading something recently about Finland, you know, the fact that they teach children at such a young age in Finland around misinformation and how to spot misinformation in comparison to facts. Maybe something broader across the entire continent is required for us to really grapple with this debate and deal with it. But Robert, a lot of pressure on industry, you know, if the pressure was there for some members to try and come up with a vaccine at lightning speed, then the pressure today is around manufacturing and production. And then, as I kind of outlined, you know, business is trusted across the political spectrum, whether you sit on the left or the right. Business does consistently continue to show up as being a trusted vehicle. And so when I come back to this exam question of, you know, has this been a good year or a bad year for the European institutions? How do you interpret not only the pressure or the focus now being placed on the business community in combination with a lack of trust that maybe we may be seeing in other parts of our institutions, specifically government? So how do you combine those two debates together, and what do you see as the green space that you can move forward through?
It's a really good question. I think just to begin, I mean, who honestly would want to have been a politician in 2020? It was definitely a year where you had to kind of feel for anybody in public office and just the extent of the decisions that they had to take. I want to start by addressing that first question you asked on, you know, has it been a good year for the EU institutions? And I mean, this has already been said by Luca to some extent, but I think that the European Commission in particular demonstrated initiative and energy in trying to resolve some of the daunting challenges in hand. Did everything go smoothly? No, but let's at least acknowledge that this European Commission has taken on some gargantuan tasks in the past 18 months, reflecting courage and vision that has been sorely lacking in previous commissions. So, I mean, I don't really buy the premature obituaries of the European project. I think, you know, the EU generally emerges from crises stronger, and I think part of that is because there is a you know, there is a sense at the moment that actually, you know, there is precariousness and there is precarity, and if you look at some of the response, when the way people rode together last in kind of Q2, Q3 of last year, when the pandemic really hit Europe, you know, there was a huge response from the private sector, from, you know, mask donations, PPE, huge support for frontline workers, you know, field hospitals and connectivity in hospitals, joining, you know, companies joining forces to build consortia that could make ventilators. And now, you know, now we're in a kind of a later wave, and yes, there is an awful lot of debate about vaccines. There is this, you know, kind of phase 2 of the pandemic with the infodemic, and I should actually point out that AstraZeneca, which is the chairman of AstraZeneca, Leif Johansson, he is a member of ERT, and as far as I know, AstraZeneca is actually producing the vaccine, producing its vaccine at cost price. So it's not a profitable venture for them. And you know, as we've seen over the past couple of weeks and months, it certainly, you know, shed, you know, quite a spotlight on them. And you know, they're reacting and trying to help. with an unprecedented situation. So to kind of move into how that links to the question of information and people's confidence and trust, I think, yes, the proximity effect and the fact that many companies were able to benefit from agile leadership, and people could feel that they were, that they were connected to their employers, and that they could feel that they were being reassured and accommodated where possible. That gap with the media and with the wider intensity of information, and the fact that people were just glued to screens all the time, just hasn't really helped. And if you look at the information bubbles that needed to be burst over the past while, that's one of the reasons why we don't have a European public sphere at the moment. It's because we have so much segmentation, and there are risks down the road that will intensify. So we need to break these silos. We need to realize some of the problems with the channels we're already using. I mean, if you look at how business reacted to the revelations about Facebook last year, you had quite a number of businesses taking a stance and participating in the Facebook advertising boycott. But people need to understand that European issues are also their issues. And I think that the European Commission and its communications team are actually doing an increasingly better job of making that clear. If you look at the cross-national media campaigns being run, if you look at the State of the Union that Ursula von der Leyen made, honestly, I think it is, we're seeing a lot of improvement and a lot of willingness to try new things. And I think that is a big help. And that is certainly something that I think the business community is watching that and also admiring of seeing Europe actually speaking with a stronger voice.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Robbie. You said something at the beginning which really struck a chord. I think the European project has been doubted at every turn and every corner. I still remember people who said, well, you can't have a European currency because it would never be possible, and we have one. They said that it wasn't possible for a single market to be created. Well, guess what? We created one of those as well. We were told we weren't going to be able to manage through the Greek crisis, and then the financial crisis, and the immigration crisis, and the Brexit crisis. And each one, as you rightly outlined, the European institutions navigated with a real sense of class and pragmatism. And so, this will be another one potentially that they will be able to manage through. But one point I did want to come back to, and we're running out of time, unfortunately. Peter, I do want to come back to this question of vaccine confidence. Our data shows that vaccine confidence is already particularly low. We've been having a debate now in the European neighborhood for the last 3 months about certain vaccines that it may or may not be up to standards, and certain vaccines that we are happy with. But the debate does impact trust in vaccines, full stop, does it not? And so how helpful is this conversation that we're having at the moment?
Yeah, thanks. But Shona actually said it very well. Explained. This is not a new issue to start with. Vaccine refusal and hesitancy is as old as vaccines. But Shona said there are those who are the, let's say, hardcore anti-vaxxers who want a natural way, or think there is a conspiracy of big pharma, or et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's that's a matter of belief and so on. But then you've got people who have legitimate questions. Is it really safe when a vaccine was developed so fast and all that? And here I think we need to engage, because in the hardcore, it's often about many other things, not about the vaccines. And so I think that we need to take it seriously, and take the current debate is about the side effects of the AstraZeneca vaccine. The European Medicines Agency has been clear on Friday already last week. It said it's fine, because there's no evidence for, any that the blood clots and so on have been caused by the vaccine, yet a whole range of countries have said they stop the vaccination. There's now a more detailed investigation going on, but personally, I don't think there is this cause of effect, but then the decisions are pretty political, and that doesn't help vaccine confidence. That's true, but you can argue that a politician may have to err on the the air of caution. There is in French law, it's even the principe de précaution, which means that basically if you can't prove that something has no side effect, it's not damaging, you shouldn't do it. I think if you apply that principle, we should just not do anything in life. But so it is an issue. And research also by the Vaccine Confidence Project at the London School has shown that people who are exposed to fake information, negative information on vaccines, actually change their mind in a negative sense, much more than people who are exposed to, let's say, positive information. So we have an issue there. So to end, I would say, one, in the medical community, it's time that we take this far more seriously. I know that pharmaceutical companies, they take it seriously because they see what it impacts. But in the medical community, we still don't take it seriously enough, I would say, because it involves social scientists and so on. We're not used to work with them. Secondly, as we also heard, it should be addressed in a local way. And as Robert said, the segmentation of information silos doesn't help because we go into these echo chambers, as we said. So we need to have the local response and then use opinion leaders, people I've never heard of, but who have 15 million followers on YouTube. I mean, they are going to make and inform people's opinion. And finally, the Commission, to illustrate what was said, is moving into the 21st century in terms of communication. It's about time. And there's going to be starting a whole campaign on vaccine confidence that is using people that other people can identify with, and not some scientists like myself, but also whether it be a football player, be some local young person, etc. And I think that's maybe, I always think that in a crisis is an opportunity for the Commission to indeed become far better in terms of communication, and because it's not that communication will solve everything. That is definitely not the case, but I would say it does, is essential. And as Lucas said, it's getting better there. But I think that we're getting there. But it's going to be very important, because if too many people refuse a vaccine, this will damage not only themselves. This is a self-inflicted one, but the whole community. You need a certain level of probably 70%, maybe a bit higher, of people vaccinated, so the whole population is protected. If we have 10 or 20% of people who refuse to take a vaccine and we go below that level, we'll never end up out of this epidemic. So it is I would say it's in our collective interest that we address this vaccine hesitancy very seriously. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fantastic set of observations and so many different points, Peter, that you've hit on that I think our viewers will probably find really interesting and insightful. A couple of, I suppose, really specific questions that I wanted to come back to very quickly. Luca and Robert, this question, I suppose, more than anything else, is for you both. What do you see as the kind of future challenges as we sit here right now and look at what trends are going to impact the European institutions, not only in the next 12 months, but in the next 3 to 4 years as we kind of roll out and move forward throughout this particular commission? So, Luca, let's come to you first. What do you see as the future challenges, not the ones that we're dealing with now, but the ones that are moving in front of us?
Well, I think as everybody knows, I mean, there are, first of all, the two traditional challenges that are greening our economies, making them sustainable, and on the other side, making sure that we can manage the digital and automation transition in a proper way. But these two big challenges pose a lot of other challenges, because it's about preserving jobs, but at the same time creating new jobs, making sure that the jobs that we preserve and the jobs that we create are decent, can really provide a decent living to everybody, but also making sure that we can really extend protection and rights to everybody. So the social dimension of this green and digital transition are also very crucial. And there is also a matter of the threats that all this poses to democracy, and to the perception of people that there is no more trust, that they cannot really have confidence in the capacity of institutions, employers, trade unions, civil society organizations to deliver for them. This gives a lot of space to the populists, and this is really a great threat for democracy. I will say that there are three key elements that all of us, institutions, social partners, civil society organizations, but also media, should keep in mind if we want to be able to cope with these challenges. The first one is that we need really to go for a long-term vision. We cannot only look at the short-term profit for companies, or short-term, perspective of getting votes in the next election for politicians. We need really to look at the future and to build a better future for everybody. The second element is to have ethics and care in the way we do it. People will not judge us just because we can deliver, but also because we have honestly tried to deliver. If we do that and we are really honest and take care, people will understand. And the third element that for me is really crucial is dialogue. We need really to build more institutional, social, civic dialogue. We need to involve people, and we have also to talk to each other in an honest manner, in a way that we can really deliver better results for everybody.
That's so nicely put, Luca. Profit, ethics and care, and dialogue. Robert, the same question to you. As you look at the trends impacting the future, what do you see as the challenges?
I mean, I completely echo what Luca said on so many points. I think he's really very, very right to put the emphasis on the long term, and on really on getting the vision and on communication. And if you look at the results of this year's Trust Barometer, and the fact that the confidence in employers, a lot of that is down to the communication, the intensified communication that CEOs and chairs engaged in when the pandemic hit. So, that communication, again, we need it on a much wider scale. Tim Berners-Lee, the father of the World Wide Web, he said just last week, he said, we're going through another step change in the speed at which the world is changing. And I think wherever you look, that step change really rings true. Green and digital transition, as Luca was saying, artificial intelligence and Industry 4.0, education, and reskilling. And I count training against disinformation in that, and information hygiene, which is, frankly, the most alarming thing in this year's report. And I haven't really had a chance to comment on it. But anyway, the creeping set-in of new lifestyles, for better or for worse, as COVID lockdowns continue to trundle on. Right now, the EU is in the thick of implementing the visions it has outlined. It's just kind of, we're warming up, if you like. While many other things beyond its control are influencing that situation and people's perspective of that situation. So I think, the best thing we can do is yes, engage in much more communication. People need to get on board with the fact that a wave of change is happening, and that it's not necessarily going to be easy at times, particularly as everyone is fatigued and worn down by the circumstances of the past year. So it will be challenging, but I think that there are opportunities. There is optimism and hope, but people need to get on board with that change, and business has accepted that this is a moment of turbocharged change, and that we need to embrace it, and that inclusion is an important part of that, but it relies on all of those actors getting around the table.
Yeah, Robert, you've touched on so many different variables, and there's so many different debates that we probably still need to have. And some of the questions that we've been getting coming in are around climate change specifically, and maybe that's a separate event that we should focus in on, because as we come out of the pandemic, how do we actually turn the page? Rowan Emsley is asking to really start to focus in on the climate debate, and both you and Luca have touched on the climate conversation. But Sean, I want to finish with you, because one of the questions we did get through was around how to actually tackle misinformation and this idea that emotion can help build and rebuild trust. And so, can you connect science, information, and public health in a certain way to help build confidence in communication, to then really help reset our democratic values and approaches? And so, in that big question, combined in with the question of trends as we look forward, what are your final comments as we kind of close out the panel?
I think we need to start intersecting in order to build trust. And there needs to be an understanding that you need empathy, you need science, and you need a whole host of different societal factors in order to better combat this. In my view, when it comes to tackling the infodemic, it's not just about the simple debunk anymore, or saying, nope, sorry, that's not true. It's about an overall context-driven way of combating misinformation and disinformation. I want to kind of look at QAnon when I talk about this, because many people didn't take QAnon that seriously by, the start of 2020 moving into the midpoint. But by the end, we have seen how conspiracy theories can be so damaging, and how that damage can intersect in so many various parts of the issues we need to solve, be that public health or be that climate change. Plenty of these conspiracy theories are so interwoven. So when it comes to tackling that, we need empathy, and every psychologist I've spoken to has said that an empathy-driven approach is really necessary. We need transparency. That was 2010 when it comes to the trust barometer, but it's still clear now that the transparency needs to be there when combating misinformation. And we need to talk with numerous different industry leaders on how to tackle it, particularly science and other factors. It's not just going to be a clean cut approach. And I think when it comes to tackling disinformation, it's going to be, unfortunately, I think, a generational issue. It's going to take a long time to come up with this, and I don't think it's going to be a silver bullet solution either.
Yeah, hopefully it won't be as long as a generation, but I hear you loud and clear. It's going to take time to resolve some of these challenges. So look, with that, let me say thank you to our fantastic panelists. I think we had a brilliant conversation, which ranged from everything from employee focus, vaccine confidence, profit and loss, ethics and care, dialogue, engagement, and a whole raft of other issues, including misinformation as well. So thank you to our panelists for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, I suppose it's back to me to close us out. I know we're a little bit out of time, over time. My apologies for that. So many different insights coming at us from different contributors. I thought it was only right that we gave them the time to speak to the various different challenges that the Trust Barometer this year does showcase. So in summary, I think a couple of different things. First and foremost, we didn't get time to debate a whole range of different topics in depth. We didn't talk about individual freedoms, climate change, education, misinformation to the degree that we would have liked to. We didn't also talk about discrimination and racism that still kind of exists as part of our European project and part of our future. But what we did get to focus in on was trust in the EU. And overarchingly, I think everyone acknowledging that this has been an extremely challenging year for everyone, whether it's politicians or whether it's people involved in vaccine manufacturing, or whether it is the end individual that is having to navigate their day-to-day challenges. We hope that the next year is going to be a slightly different one. And kind of summarizing and wrapping up, there's 2 or 3 things that I would say. First and foremost, everyone that has signed up for the webinar today will actually get a copy of the longer PDF version of our Trust Barometer. So you will get that in your inboxes. And so if you have questions, please do come back and have a conversation with me or one of my colleagues at Edelman Brussels. Second, we're delighted that we've been able to do not only the annual Trust Barometer, but we've done 4 or 5 individual Trust Barometers during the course of the last year as well, to really see how the pandemic has been tracking. And so we've got a lot of data, a lot of reports. And if you're interested in trying to create a bilateral or an individual conversation for your organization, then also come back and have a conversation with us. And we're more than happy to construct that for you. And then finally, it would be amiss of me to not say that my name is Gurpreet. I'm the general manager for Edelman Brussels. We are a communications advisory and public affairs advisory organization. That's what we do. And so if you are working through those challenges of either communications or public affairs, and you would like to speak to someone, an expert that sits not that far away from you, then come and drop us an email, and either me or one of my colleagues can come back and speak to you about how we may be able to help and navigate you through those challenges. So with that, thank you so much for dialing in to the Trust Barometer at 2021 EU results. And thank you again, and have a fantastic day. And I hope this will be a different year to 2020. Thank you.